Okay, then I would like to welcome everyone to the last webinar of the AGENET webinar series in 2023, which was postponed from November to, well, today. We will be talking about ethical concerns, envisioning ethnographic fieldwork with cognitively impaired older adults. It is a special issue that came out in the Journal of Aging Studies, and we have today presenters from each of the contributions to the journal, as well as the editors of the special issue. Christina Douglas, who is, I'm not sure, like who are you at the University of Aberdeen? Sorry, I don't have this information. Okay, based at the University of Aberdeen. Oh, I'm very sorry. And Matthew Lariviere, also based at the Northumbria University. And Barbara Pieta from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, who is unfortunately not able to join us today due to health reasons. So the webinar is organized by AGENET, which is a network of EASA, European Association for Social Anthropologists. And this special issue came about as one of AGENET-sponsored panels at one of the previous EASA conferences. So I'm very happy that we are kind of, AGENET has been supporting this this special issue, or leading the way from its inception, and now today also celebrating the coming out very soon of this whole complete special issue. And with that, I would like to hand over to Matthew and Christina. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate for dealing with us and for just accepting to kind of postpone. And I apologize on Barbara's behalf for not being here today. She's really unwell, and it was kind of an emergency. And thank you very much, of course, to the contributors to this special issue, because without them, there wouldn't be any special issue. And we'll just be talking a little bit to start with how we came with this idea of doing the special issue, then just moving on a little bit on kind of the themes that run across all the papers, and then we'll hand out to our contributors to actually present their own papers, and at the end we will have a little bit of discussion. So one of the things that I just wanted to add that is actually we have another editor who is Professor Maria Vesperi from New College, Florida. So she couldn't join us. They have quite a few issues at their university as well, so she couldn't join us either. But she is one of the ones who was on the panel originally and who is on the special issue as well. So I'll just be starting a little bit with just kind of letting you know how we came with this idea and why are we going again back to these things about ethics. So as Svetlana was saying, this started in kind of 2019, end of 2019, and then we proposed as a panel at EASA for 2020. And when Barbara and I were having a discussion about the issues that and the struggles that we had with our research, we realized that actually there are things to do both with overgovernance and undergovernance. And just to give you an idea about this is my research takes place in Scotland. So I conduct research with people with advanced dementia who live in care homes. And Barbara, who is based at Max Planck, has done research with people with dementia, their families and their carers in Italy. So while I had this kind of overgovernance over my research, Barbara had very much what maybe we can call it some form of less restrictive and a form of undergovernance. Both in Germany and in Italy, there isn't something similar to what they have in America, the IRB, or what we have here in the UK, research ethics committees. So there were kind of issues that were transgressing national context and the discipline of anthropology as well when we were talking with the contributors during our panel. And somebody might say, well, there is quite a bit of literature on ethics governance as well. And it was quite a bit of proliferation of ethics governance and regulation literature, mostly after 2000. But during that panel in 2020, we actually realized that there are still issues of friction with ethics and with other forms of regulatory governance that still persist despite concerns being raised for almost 2 decades. So this one in itself is kind of an ethical concern. And there are some authors, and amongst them probably one of the most famous one, Adam Hitchcock, who is from the UK, was saying, I think in 2006 or something like that, immediately after the UK started having lots of research ethics committees regulating social science research as well. He was saying, well, better than just spending the time resisting this new form of governance of research ethics, better just learn the process. And actually, this is not quite the case, as we realized during that panel, and we've seen in this special issue as well, because there are many other issues. It's not only about learning the process, but there are actually some systemic issues that coming into play. And there are issues of representations and politics of knowledge production and of representation in ethnographic research with adults living with cognitive impairment. So it's not only about learning the process, it's actually the effects that this over-governance or under-governance in some cases can actually have even more. So in 2022, we were joined by Dr. Matthew Lariviere, who is now an assistant professor at Northumbria University, and Maria Vesperi, who's a professor at New College of Florida. She was on the original panel as well as a discussant to curate the special issue for the Journal of Aging Studies to address some of the issues that we've originally identified. And in the special issues, there aren't actually very many people from the original panel. Some of them didn't want to take necessarily their presentation a little bit further, but I think this shows also that put together the presentations we have during that panel and in the special issues, that there are actually a lot of people who are dealing with this kind of issues, ethical issues with people, with adults who have cognitive impairment. So now going to the special issues, there are a few unifying themes that cut across all the papers. And one of them, of course, is about ethics governance. And as many of the people in this special issue show, this can have a massive detrimental effect on ethnographic research conducted with people living with cognitive impairment. And it can limit massively who can be involved as a prospective participant. And this one depends very often on the formal medicalization of their condition. And this, as James Fletcher has discussed in a little bit more detail, it is actually an ethical concern in itself. But also this ethics governance can also deepen an unevenness of representation in research, especially when people living with cognitive impairment or those ones who are unable to consent for themselves, because this one is not always diagnosed, are actually avoided by researchers to be recruited given the lengthy and overly bureaucratic procedures. Again, another actually ethical concern that comes very much through a fallacy of protection of regulatory governance. There is anyway an equally problematic issue of not having a more formalized guideline or having loose regulatory ethics, as Barbara and Francesco are discussing in their paper in some places. While less constructive and less formal regulations can actually create significant space to engage with what we might like to call the real ethical issues, more or less as opposed to what can be perceived ethics governance as a bureaucratic process. This can at the same time leave the individual researchers somehow adrift in a very complex landscape of ethical issues and how to address these. And it was one of the things that Barbara and I were discussing originally. And this can include some issues of representations in context of tensed relations and power dynamics, especially during field work, but also during the writing process as well. So in a way, it is kind of ironic that both the existence of tight formalized procedures and on the one hand, and on the other one, less relaxed ethics regulations can raise its own ethical concerns. So this brings into discussion a wider question somehow related to anthropology. And this one was the topic of a relatively recent special issue in the American Anthropologist on their 50th anniversary. So what good is anthropology if actually we have these issues of representation of people with cognitive impairment that can sometimes be because of these kind of issues with ethics governance? And how can we bring awareness around what good anthropology or ethnography more generally, because the special issue doesn't have only anthropologists, what good anthropology does, and how can we make aware the regulatory bodies as ethical issues that should concern them as well? Another issue that cuts across all the papers are related to what can be called form of resistance and envisioning alternatives. And some of them can be conceptual, some of them could be related to individual researchers, others as collective enterprises, and some of them can be methodological as well. And I am not going to talk very much about this because I think most of the presenters will talk about this, but kind of a conclusion about the things presented in a special issue. It seems that all ethical issues, regardless whether they are in relation to what can be called unethical procedures related to ethical practice in fieldwork or in writing, in issues of representation, all of these ones unveil actually ethics as matters of concern. And if we follow Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, concern brings us actually closer to care. So in the articles in this special issue, such matters of concern, I think, go a little bit further by being effectively invested. And this we noted a lot through the editorial process. All of the ethical issues that have been discussed, they were massively effectively invested by their authors. And so in this way, they become actually matters of care, not only matters of concern. And even though they have their own politics of justice, resistance, and representation. So although care cannot be equated, of course, with morality or ethics, as many scholars show, ethnographic engagement with ethical concerns in research involving people living with cognitive impairment can actually contribute to an anthropology of the good, how Joel Robbins has named it, as a way of imagining or envisioning better, or in the case of our special issue, ethical outcomes, and to do an anthropology of care as well, both as a topic, but also as an ethical practice. And I think it's time to let the authors speak about their own papers, because everybody probably will be more excited about that. So Matthew, I'll just let Matthew introduce them, and then how actually the format will work.
Thanks, Christina. So hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Riviere, as Christina's already graciously introduced me, Associate Professor of Gerontology at Northumbria University. Again, one reason why I'm happy to be involved in this project is because I haven't been involved in an anthropology department in about 14 years now. So I'm obviously this ethnographer working at the intersections of social policy, gerontology, or health science more broadly, sort of thing too. So I was really interested in being involved for that reason. And with that in mind, we've had a fantastic amount of contributions from people all around the world to help us explore in detail kind of these ethical entanglements and regimes related to cognitive impairment. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce each of our 6 speakers. Again, just to remind you that Jamie Towser, for those who arrived late, is not able to join us today, along with our co-editor, Barbara Pieta. Each speaker, due to a recent dropout, will have about 8 minutes to speak instead of 7 minutes to speak. So you're getting a little bit extra time there for each presentation. And then we will hold questions after every speaker has spoken, and there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions then, either by writing questions in the chat function for one of the hosts to field it forward on your behalf, or you can raise your hand using that functionality and ask your questions directly to the speakers as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Shavat Eilat, from Tel Aviv University in Israel. And She's going to speak about the shadow of dementia, listening to undecidability ethnographic interviews with persons suspecting possible dementia. So Shivat, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Christina. My name is Shivat Eilat, and I speak to you as a PhD student from Tel Aviv University, located on the land of Sheikh Munis village in Israel, Palestine. I live in Haifa, where the ruins of the city of Haifa find a way to make themselves present, haunting the new city. I'm talking to you while the future and lives of so many Palestinian Gazans and hostages have been taken away and eliminated without a second thought. The future of this piece of land, the future is sticky, it's muddy, and its handprints leave a muddy mark on the retina that refuses to come off. Fear of memory loss and its undecidabilities seems almost homeopathic at present. What is going to be? Where is it all going? Who is responsible to forcefully foreclose the future of inhabitants of this land? Many of my interlocutors ask these questions regarding their own future trajectories of aging. And now it is asked about the future and its horizons in general. It's also difficult to talk about undecidability at the moment. The present moment requires decidability, or you'll be outcasted. In my part of the world, you have to support the war, we have to protect ourselves, we are told, and so we think. We have to decide. There is no place for life in the middle, no place for hesitation or doubt. The enemy awaits our undecidability. Is undecidability a possible affect? Can it be of this place and of this time? So, in light of that, or the impending shadows of the impossibility of lives, some afterthoughts or maybe future directions about undecidability, shadows, and ethnography. I asked in the opening of the article, what is at stake when we turn our gaze to life worlds where shadows accompany the lived experience? What kind of ethnographic engagement can better situate us on the seam between our interlocutors' affective engagement with their world and the possibilities it creates for living within pressing categories and manifestations of life? In the article, I attempted to illuminate the social, biodiagnostic, and cultural shadows of dementia hovering in the background of everyday experience by attending to conversations I had with one interlocutor, Tamara. I used the concept of shadow to suggest an epistemic entity that can be constituted within and reflect lurking presences accompanying my interlocutor's daily negotiations of the possibility of dementia around moments of forgetfulness. The goal of the larger research project was to explore the extent of possibilities for life with dementia in Israel. The purpose was to address the interlocking dynamics between the lived experience of suspecting the possibility of memory change and the spheres of life with dementia as a social imaginary and a social problem space. I propose to try and view shadows as valid social actors that arise from the convergence of lived experiences of fear and suspicion and the social imaginaries in which they are embedded. Thus, by suggesting that shadows be taken seriously, I recommend paying attention to the seams that weave the personal experience of fear and the social manifestations it reverberates. In the article, I mentioned that Tamara addressed how I acknowledged or was attuned to her shadowy speech, her fears, and her suspicions regarding her memory, and how I allowed the fear of dementia to inhabit the shadow as a silent partner in the encounter with her. I think that the shadow is a fruitful epistemological tool, as it makes one look for different ways to tell the narrative of the encounter, of the ethnographic encounter, when something hovers over the encounter. The shadow can also represent epistemological and even ontological differences containing meta or pluri-worlds that resides within the shadow and can encompass the narrator, the narration, and the listener. To end, I hope to discuss further with you the possibility of the ethnographer as one who is attuned to shadow, who is listening to shadows. Can we think of shadows in ethnography and shadow ethnography as a sort of a situation that enables recognizing what is unlikely to be recognized or cognized? Can shadows be signposts when the ethnographer is trying to set herself within situations of highly disorientating and shaded realities? Thank you. I hope to think about these issues with you.
Great, thank you very much, Shvat. It's a very provocative way to end that presentation. Again, just for everyone who may have just joined us, we're going to hold questions until everyone has spoken right now. So we're going to move on to the second paper, which is from Barbara Pieta and Francesco Diodati. Barbara from Mexican Institute, but again, it's not here today. Francesco from the University Catholic of the Sacred Heart. The paper is entitled "The Ethnographer, Research Participants, and the Meaningful Others, Gray Zones of Relationality and the Ethics of Ethnographic Dementia Research." So Francesco, over to you when you're ready.
Oh, I'm ready. Thank you, Matthew. So I'm here also on behalf of my colleague who unfortunately couldn't be here, and I'm sharing the presentation. So trying to be very, very quick. So in this article, we try to reflect on what we call as meaningful others. So we try to propose a new heuristic model to think about the ethical conflict that occurs in ethnography. We believe that this model is particularly suited for dementia research, but we also believe or we hope that this model can also be extended far beyond the topic of dementia care research. So in the article, we described how the current ethical debates in ethnography, but in qualitative research in general, overlook how the social networks around people with dementia are affected by the qualitative ethnographic research. So we, despite a strong scholarly interest in the topic of the social person, the social surrounding the individual with dementia, so far we have been very little discussion about the political implication of involving the surrounding the individual with dementia in qualitative research. The role has to usually be can introduce to get papers, or at least the individual just facilitate the research, the fieldwork, and the conduction of interviews. We try to nominate those people as meaningful others, so social actors who are simultaneously outside the research focus and bound to the research participants. We are not referring to the key informants, so the few actors in the target population who are the principal source of information about the local world, but more broadly, individuals who represent the main research focus, and also the principal ethical orientation of an ethnographer. An ethnographer who, for example, want to research on the way individuals with dementia struggle to live in a world that is full of individualistic discourse and ethical imperatives on being active in old age. or just like me, ethnographer would like to shed light on the way caregivers suffer and endures a role imposed by society in a world that is shrinking welfare and public aid to home care. And the question is that we believe that the research condition of being in relationship with these meaningful others give rise to what we call a free zone of ethical conduct. So the question is that these meaningful others are social actors who, as I said before, outside the research focus, but bound to the research participant by a moral relationship, a relationship that is the most significant in the local moral world, following the Klein definition. We argue that these gray areas of ethical conduct, so areas where the ethical conduct of the ethnographer perceives is ethical conduct as something very nuanced and uncertain, can be often linked to the research condition of operating between and across this ethical relationship with the meaningful others. Because firstly, the ethnographers need to recognize nuances, but also potentially conflicting moral views between the main research participant and the meaningful others. And secondly, because the researcher needs to consider also his or her own ethical position within this moral relationship and how it affects the production of ethnographic account. And finally, of course, we are talking about the politics of representation. So how the article, the thesis that we wrote affects the impact that those can have on the local moral world of the research participant, especially in a world where it's more easy to access information in real time. And we presented two cases, and I will discuss briefly each one of them. Of course, these cases were written in a very personal way, so I will try to describe the case of my missing co-author. In short way, my personal experience was that of doing a research for my PhD in anthropology, which was completed 2 years ago, to try to gather caregivers' narratives of fatigue and endurance. So I was talking about specifically the case of being in an Alzheimer's cafe. And there was this moment when the caregivers were left alone with the psychologist, and the individual with dementia were brought in another room, so that the psychologist can offer them some relief and some comfort and some emotional support. And of course, I'm not talking about reporting case of explicit violence or violence in any way. I'm just talking about, for example, people complaining that their children were incapable of accepting the decline of their parents, or were very harassed and rude. Or just cases where, for example, people were complaining about a wife or a husband who doesn't want to be there every day. Is an holiday to bring this, to bring my wife to the adult daycare center. Or she said that I'm putting her away in a place full of old foods, for example. So, of course, I'm talking about stories that were private in the sense that caregivers would not easily share them in front of their team affected by dementia, or for fear of hurting their feelings, or in front of other family members. For example, a parent who is complaining about the children who were incapable of accepting the decline of his wife, for example. And I eventually became troubled by the gathering of these stories, because, as I said, I was very, let's say, uncertain of how to report and take into account the story. How was I, for example, making a bad portrait, let's say, like this, of my interlocutors, and what if these meaningful others were reading about these stories? Stories that were, I'm going to say, talk in the absence of those others, but I see my feeling was that I was in relationship also in a subtle way with those meaningful others. Of course, I talked with people with dementia during the conversation, during my participation in the meeting of the cafe, but at the same time, I felt that this relationship was a different relationship in an ethical term, even if it was driven away from my epistemological focus that was on gathering the caregiver's point of view, and try to preserve this point of view in my personal case. So try to have this particular vision of care, and not try to necessarily include that of the person with dementia. This was my personal research focus, it was my personal research objective. In the end, I adopted aggregation and anonymization strategies. So, for example, I only use the caregiving stories offered by the people who I interview outside the cafe meeting. And I reported in a very general manner, omitting any depth of geographical data from the discourses that I heard in the cafe. And sometimes I use medical manner. So, for example, I make some fragments part of collective narratives for children often complain about, for example. And this was my idea that even if we were not talking about and was not questioning violence and evil and fieldwork, sometimes also reporting this situation as standing between polarized dimension was troublesome and was can be equally troubling for the ethnographer, because it also calls into question a dichotomic understanding of character and life, where not necessarily bad feelings, reporting, for example, quarrels or just expression of anger can be considered a total expression of bad character. And this was my
Francesco, I'm sorry for interrupting you. It's only about 1 minute left, so we can really have time for the other one. So I'm really sorry for interrupting like this.
I will be very quick now. For the case of my other colleagues, was a similar experience, but in the opposite direction. She was doing PhD research, ethnographic PhD research on individuals with dementia in Italy as well. And she wanted to highlight how people with dementia were positioning themselves vis-a-vis this individualistic discourse about old age. And she experienced the situation of being involved in family relations inside the household. Even if she would like to report the perspective of the individual with dementia, she has to talk with caregivers, with daughters. And she was not sure about how she has to foreground experience with individuals of dementia, or she has to include different voices, that of the children that live inside the house. And this process would sort of, how can I say, the violent sort of treatment of treatment to the initial idea of preserving the perspective of the individual with dementia without letting that the caregivers would, how can I say, would interrupt this voice, would cover this voice. So in the end, she adopted a different approach, that of including the voices of the individual caregivers and adopting a more multi-voiceness, adopting a multi-voice ethnography. So to conclude, we believe that the presence of the meaningful others generate gray zones in the ethics of ethnographic research. We also consider how this presence put in crisis, of course, individualistic understanding of research ethics that consider the relationship with individual actors as if the individual actors were alienated from the social environment. And we believe that incorporating a multi-level and interdependent level of relationality for debates on the ethical and ethnographic research allows to build a more situated and included research that at the same time can leave the possibility of taking even a moral stance in our research, but without obscuring the voice of those who live lives. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Francesco. We'll move on now to our third speaker. And our third speaker is going to be James Rupert Fletcher from the University of Manchester. James is here this afternoon to talk to us about regulating the disenfranchised, reciprocity and resistance under the Mental Capacity Act. Over to you, James, once you are ready.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm afraid my paper is probably going to be a bit dry compared to the others because it's just about legislation. Specifically, it's about the Mental Capacity Act in England and Wales. And for people who aren't familiar with that, the Mental Capacity Act stipulates that research involving people with cognitive impairments has to be approved by the Health Research Authority. And that's the case even if the research doesn't engage with formal healthcare services. So 2 examples of that situation. One is some research I did on informal care networks. And that's particularly funny because the rationale of the research was to avoid any formal services, but I still had to go through the Health Research Authority because my participants had dementia. And the second example is my current work exploring public transport services. And again, still had to go through the Health Research Authority because of the Mental Capacity Act. So for me, this raises some interesting questions about authority and reciprocity. And in the paper, I argue that capacity law imposes blanket state control over people with dementia through administrative medicalization. So basically, the law institutionalizes people with dementia as a medical entity, and so they become the property of formal healthcare. And yet the entire point of my work is to highlight the exclusion of people with dementia from the formal care system, because the reality of most dementia is it's a family affair with very little service engagement. So I start to wonder about the implications for citizenship and justice, which have really become core commitments in dementia studies over recent years. And it strikes me that the Mental Capacity Act establishes state control over people with dementia, but doesn't give them much back in return. And that seems very at odds with a notion of reciprocal rights and responsibilities between states and citizens that we might consider citizenship. And I see this in the field a lot. So I go out and explain research governance to my participants. And they're sort of astonished that there is so much Health Research Authority effort that's gone into managing their involvement in research without them ever knowing about it at all. And at the same time, these people can't get a dentist appointment, they can't get a care assistant for more than 15 minutes. So I look at this situation, and following a citizenship tradition, I'm drawn to this idea of resistance. And I think it's important to caveat the idea of resistance quite a bit, because it intuitively sounds like some sort of deliberate opposition or fight. And sometimes it is. So, for example, the Health Research Authority ethics process is really laborious and unpleasant. And my application for my current project took 26 months. And understandably, some people are just not going to pursue 26 months of ethics in a 36-month project. So some people just don't comply outright. But the reality of resistance is that it also spans all sorts of micro-political contradictions of power. So sometimes resistance can emerge unintentionally from the systems of control themselves. So an example of this is the propensity for researchers to accidentally breach the Mental Capacity Act, which seems to happen so often that you can actually find examples published in journal articles fairly easily, where people have, not assessed capacity, or they've gone through university ethics. And I think that these examples represent really important forms of something like resistance. And in the paper, I argue that ethics creep makes resistance to mental capacity procedures more likely. So ethics creep's obviously this ever-expanding bureaucratization of research governance in the social sciences. And as an example, my current project went through 4 different offices in my own university before even going to the Health Research Authority. And then the application's 40 pages long, the protocol's 170 pages long. I've subsequently sent the committee more than 50 documents at a time on several occasions. So crazily large amounts of administrative work here. And on the other end of that process, some poor sod's got to sit down and read through all of that and then respond with queries. And then we go back and forth for months addressing the queries. That's obviously unmanageable. So at that sort of scale, all sorts of accidental errors and deliberate transgressions are going to slip through the net. And that's perhaps the greatest irony of ethics creep for me. There's this tendency for larger and increasingly unmanageable bureaucracies to simultaneously incentivize unethical behavior and to provide more space for unethical actors to operate in, because they're less likely to be found out in that system. And that's a really critical observation, I think. Bureaucratization doesn't tackle unethical practice, it can actually encourage it and facilitate it. And so it becomes an unethical practice. So I think ultimately the Mental Capacity Act and associated research governance is probably now the most ubiquitous unethical practice in contemporary British dementia research. It erodes the citizenship of people with dementia. And the point that I want to highlight is that resistance to that unethical process is already built into the process. So this is why I would argue that our job as ethical dementia researchers is to probably reflect on how we might engage with an ethics of ethical resistance to ethics. And that's a mouthful to end on.
Great, thanks, James. That is quite a mouthful to end on. And just thinking about 26 months spent going through HRA ethics, and that gives me nightmares. So thank you for sharing that. Right, okay, on to our fourth paper now, which is by, Emma Balkin and her team from Aalborg University. And this is about the ethics and the impossibility of the consent form, ethnography in a Danish nursing home. So Emma, over to you when you are ready.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. And good evening, everyone. My paper takes its starting point in an incident that occurred early on in my fieldwork and which opened my eyes to how complex research ethics can be on the ground when working with vulnerable older adults. The main argument I seek to make is that procedural ethics, however well intended, can sometimes end up putting the researcher in an unethical situation in the field in the ways that are impossible to anticipate beforehand. In 2021, I conducted 6 months of ethnographic fieldwork in 2 Danish nursing homes. The focus of the study was on the existential well-being of the oldest old residents. My article centers on one interlocutor whom I've called Helen. Helen knew who I was before we even met each other, and she was the only one of my interlocutors who actively sought me out and asked to be interviewed. She had an important story to share about the challenges she had experienced with living in institutional care. Because Helen was so lucid when I met her the first time, and because she asked to be interviewed, I made an assumption that informed consent was not going to be a problem. And that soon proved to be naive. When I went into Helen's room to meet her the following day, as we'd agreed, I handed her the information sheet and the consent form, and I explained the terms of the interview, that she would have anonymity and so on. And Helen put the forms to the side and just jumped right into telling me her story. And at this point, I just figured that the signature on the consent form was a formality that we would get to. But we then spoke for several hours as she shared the details of her experiences of what can only be described as a difficult and undignified time in the nursing home. And it was only as we were wrapping up our conversation several hours later that she again became aware of the consent form, and her demeanor instantly changed. From someone who had confidently and openly shared her story with me, she suddenly became visibly nervous and afraid. No, I don't think I want to sign this, she said hesitantly. And this was confusing to me because she had asked to be interviewed and she had agreed to the terms as I'd explained them. But it transpired then that when she had been going through the difficult time with the care staff, she had gone to the authorities for help. This had, in fact, led to a worsening of the care she received, and she felt both responsible and also deceived because she had signed a number of documents in that process. So as a consequence, Helen was now scared of signing any documents. While the consent form seeks to protect both researcher and participant, in this situation, it triggered anxiety in the participant and also put me as a researcher in a challenging situation because the most ethical way to act situationally was at odds with the requirements of the procedural ethics of my university. Without Helen's signature, I would not be able to tell the story that she so keenly wanted to share. But the mere presence of the form in the room had turned what was the makings of a trusting ethnographic relationship between us into a fraught situation. It was not talking to me or sharing her story or even being recorded on tape that made Helen uncomfortable. It was the requirement for her signature on the consent form. Because of her previous experiences with documentation, this form triggered her anxiety, making her mind cloud over, and was starting to cause her physical discomfort. For me, the ethical obligation was first and foremost to protect Helen's mental and physical well-being. And for that reason, I told her to not sign the form and that it was not worth the torment. However, Helen had also entrusted me with her story with the goal of raising awareness of what it was like to live in a nursing home, and in the hopes of sparing others the same degrading experience as Helen had had. She still wanted me to use her story. She just didn't want to sign the form. As such, the form, rather than foreclosing any ethical dilemmas, put us both in a difficult situation. This case raises a number of issues which highlight the tension between procedural and situational ethics. First of all, it was difficult for me to ascertain whether cognitive impairment was even present to begin with, because Helen's anxiety and depression caused only transient cognitive impairment. It further highlights that what constitutes ethical behavior in the situation cannot always be anticipated or planned in advance. Procedural ethics can lead to ethics being considered a formality external to the research process. It also makes normative assumptions around who a research participant is. Produced for the use by a particular kind of person, it makes assumptions as to the abilities of a standard person, potentially excluding those who fall outside of the normative assumptions of literacy, sightedness, cognitive reasoning, and the fine motor skills to even sign one's name. As many have argued before me, it's foolish to think that a signature on a consent form is any form of guarantee for actual ethical behavior in the field. But in this case, the form itself was not only not a guarantee, but actually the instigator of the ethical dilemma. As such, my main argument in this paper is that when researching with vulnerable older adults, we need more leeway to negotiate ethical situations as they occur, because if the only tool we have is the consent form, we run the risk of excluding the already marginalized voices of some of the most vulnerable persons in our societies. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Emma. I'm seeing the invisible claps over there from Christina as well. So just for that, yeah, again, another great presentation. I think also highlighting, as James as well, and perhaps in contrast to the presentation from Francesco and Shvat, is the challenges with these kind of procedural ethical approaches sort of thing versus kind of more situated approaches in which we actually engage with and conduct ourselves with people with cognitive impairment sort of thing too. So rife discussions I'm sure have there later on today, but thank you for that initial one. Now, without further ado, we'll now move on to our fifth paper today, which is from Lily Shapiro at the Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute. Lily's going to talk to us today about expanding the ethnographic toolkit, using medical documents to include kinless older adults living with dementia and qualitative research. So Lily, welcome, and over to you when you're ready.
There, okay, I unmuted myself. Can you guys see my screen? Cool, I'll get started, and thanks, first thanks to the organizers of this special issue and the webinar. This has been really fun, and to my co-panelists. And thanks as well to my co-authors. This research and writing was done with a large and fabulous team, so I'm very grateful to all of them. So I'll get started. William, not his real name, began complaining of memory problems in the summer of 1997 when he was in his 70s, according to his medical records. That same year, he lost a kidney to cancer, but neuropsychological testing showed no indications of cognitive decline. He continued to complain to his physicians about memory and balance issues, but the notes from his research study visits tell us that he was a, quote, nice man, alert and active, and that his scores on cognitive screening tests remained normal. Meanwhile, elsewhere in his medical chart, we can see traces of other social and embodied instabilities. He struggled with depression and went on and off the antidepressant medication paroxetine, Paxil, following the deaths of his brother and then his mother in the early 2000s. William had regular office visits to manage increasing knee pain and was eventually recommended for knee replacement surgery. Scheduling and logistical complications arose, however, and are visible in the medical record, in part because William was without close kin to care for him after the surgery and lacked the means to hire in-home help. One note in his chart reads, office visit, consult with social services re scheduling surgery / after surgery care. Patient appears to have nobody to assist him after surgery. We never met William, but he was one of the nearly 1 million older adults without close kins, in America, when he developed Alzheimer's disease a few years later. Rather than meeting him in person, we came to know about William through our involvement with the Adult Changes in Thought, or ACT study. ACT is an ongoing population-based prospective cohort study that began in 1994 in Seattle, USA. The study randomly selects people aged 65 and older from the membership of Kaiser Permanente Washington, which is an integrated healthcare delivery system. We can talk more about what that means in America, and invites them to take part. After administering a detailed baseline questionnaire and a thorough consent process, ACT investigators then follow participants forward in time, conducting research visits every 2 years that involve extensive cognitive screening and physical tests to identify incident cases of dementia and Alzheimer's disease as they occur. Importantly, for our purposes, at the time that people agree to participate in the ACT study, they do not have cognitive impairment, and they consent for their data to be used in numerous ways by the many researchers involved with ACT. This unique design addresses some of the ethical and legal concerns that arise when doing research with adults with cognitive impairment in the United States. So some of these issues, and we can talk more about this too. Most health research in the US is federally funded, and most federally funded research is subject to human subject review. Additional protections are required by human subjects review boards for research with vulnerable populations, which includes people with, quote, diminished capacity to consent. Most often, what this looks like in doing research with people with cognitive impairment is attaining consent from a legal proxy alongside assent from the subject. This is a little complicated to begin with. It's not always easy to identify who can serve as a legal proxy, but it becomes more complex for people who don't have close kin. And here we're defining close kin as an adult child or a spouse. About 6.5% of adults over 55 in the US do not have a living spouse or adult child. In our sample, it was closer to a little over 8%. So 64 total people. So why did we choose the ACT study? Partly because it's difficult because of these sort of legal constraints, which are important in many ways, to do research with this population, but it's also very important to learn things about them. So we were curious about what other kinds of data streams or sources we might be able to use to do so. Because the ACT study had access to a large bank of patient information in the form of these abstracted medical records and chart notes, we decided to see what we could learn about people by reading through their medical records and analyzing them with an ethnographic eye. All the documents were each coded by 2 qualitative team members, one of whom had a PhD in anthropology, who created detailed analytic memos documenting their analysis process, coding decisions. Code memos and further analyses and writings were also done collaboratively. So we could talk more about that too if there's time. So to what extent can we consider this work ethnographic? Because on the one hand, what we're reading is not sort of a faithful record of a person's life. It's not their own interpretation in their own words, although we were surprised at how often their own words do appear in the medical record. But it's somebody else's interpretation of a particular patient's situation. There are many gaps and silences when people aren't at the doctor's office or where the doctor doesn't choose to record something, and we can't necessarily read into those. So we do not argue that these represent complete narratives, but they offer a partial and oblique entry into the point of view, expressed feelings, and life experiences of study participants. We were actually consistently surprised at how present the social is in the medical record, how often questions of care and caregiving and living arrangements, rising rent, kinship, friendship, all of these things sort of show up in the medical record. And as I said, it often included reported direct speech of the participants themselves. So drawing inspiration from our colleagues in social history, we read these documents by and large along the grain rather than against it. In Stoller's formation. We read for that is to say, we read for the traces that were visible rather than attempting to recreate or imagine lives from the silences in these records. For instance, one ACT referral document reads, she was widowed 8 years ago, relocated from her home in West Seattle to Kent when her son was seriously ill and has since died 6 years ago. His daughter has been supportive contact to patient over the years and resides in the immediate area. Patient's daughter died in 1980. Patient is one of many offspring, and they have all since expired. Patient notes that she feels isolated, lonely, and still working through grief and loss issues. From this brief note, we get several important details about this participant's life. We know that she outlived her husband and 2 children before developing dementia. We know that she felt lonely and grieved these losses, even as other comments elsewhere in her record indicated her need for greater support and her concerns over her own balance and mobility. Her granddaughter offered periodic support, but after a series of falls, the participant decided to hire in-home help a few hours a week. So, quote, she does not have to, subquote, depend on my granddaughter. From this, we can recreate some of the shifts that precipitated this person's limited family support and some of the people and systems that stepped in or tried to in the absence of a living spouse or child. So, in conclusion, attending ethnographically to medical records, especially when used in conjunction with other methods, I don't think we think this replaces other kinds of ethnographic research, may be one way to make research with older adults more inclusive of populations with cognitive impairment, particularly those who do not have care partners or close family members to consent on their behalf. Learning about these people's lives and circumstances is complicated, yet very important in order to generate evidence and inform policies and practices to better support people like William. Secondary analysis of existing data sets, particularly the unstructured chart notes from medical records, the unstructured text from medical chart notes that we considered here is one way to do this. But there may be other sources that are similar to this and could represent a rich area for methodological innovation for ethnographers. Thank you so much to all of you, the team, the ACT study, etc.
Thank you, Lily. That was great. Thank you very much. Right. Now, we are meant to have a final paper now from Barbara Groot and her team. Now, I do not see any of their names listed in the list of people on this call, so I think. So if you are part of that group, can you please make yourself known now? Right. The tumbleweeds in silence. I'm going to say no one's probably here then from that. Right. Well, in that case, thank you to the 5 speakers we have had this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are calling from today. I think just give a round of applause to them first. You're not unmuted as well. Chair's prerogative there. And just now, we now have time for about half an hour now for Q&A session. So any questions for any of the 5 guests we have today, or the editors as well, if you want to ask us anything, again, feel free to use the raise hand function, or if you want to, you can enter your questions directly into the chat and we can ask them on your behalf. Yes, David, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting set of papers. My question comes, I guess, primarily for James, about the Mental Capacity Act. It's very interesting. We can all very much relate to the obstacles and excessive bureaucracy. I did wonder, though, if we flip around the different purposes that the Mental Capacity Act actually serves, I wonder if there's a little bit of conflation going on between ethics creep and bureaucracy. At one point, you talked about the Act itself as an oppressive tool of research governance. And of course, the Act itself was passed without research in mind at all. It's a duty that lays on anyone in the population making decisions on behalf of someone else who may be unable to make those decisions themselves. And in some of those contexts, it very much is about upholding their autonomy. If we look at court of protection decisions and how that's played out, it kind of made me think, when listening to Emma talk about the difficulties with written consent, if you want to, maybe to play devil's advocate, if we were to follow the spirit of the Mental Capacity Act, it would be saying we are making all reasonable efforts to help this person make and communicate their decision. And so for Emma's example, that might be about being flexible about whether you need to communicate that decision in a written form. So I just wondered if there are other facets when it comes to that in your account.
So I think I've probably missed a key part of that in the talk, which I do speak to a little bit in the paper, but that obviously you're totally right, which is that the Mental Capacity Act isn't really about research. Like, research is very much a sort of afterthought, a tiny little section in there that lays out, you know, I wasn't there developing the Mental Capacity Act, so I don't know what the people in the room were thinking, but obviously it lays out a process that we go through, which is, you know, this committee sanctioned by the Secretary of State, which in practice sends us down the HRA route, which on the one hand leads to this greater administrative burden simply because in the stakes of ethics, universities will have a couple of degrees of ethics. So we'll have low risk, high risk, this sort of thing. And then you have like the creme de la creme is the NHS ethics, which we all know is a whole different beast, and for very good reasons is far more difficult to get through, which is a bit of a problem. I think that that's one part of where ethics creep comes into it, and that expansion of the bureaucracies that we have to deal with. But I think another important part of that is that also no one's thought about this from the HRA's perspective. Like, the HRA, it's not really in the interest of one of their committees to sit down with an ethnographer. My ethics committee meeting was an hour long, and we really didn't discuss ethics at all. I spent the entire time telling them about, you know, social research methodologies and ontology and epistemology and these sorts of conversations, which I understand why you would look at my proposal and think, this is mad. What is this? Does this count as research? But then I obviously end up going through these quite elaborate processes of giving a sort of undergraduate crash course in social epistemology, which I shouldn't be doing. It's not in my interest, and it's not in the HRA's interest, and obviously it's not at all in the interest of people with dementia. So I think you're totally right that it's a bit of a sort of inadvertent contingency of the legislation that research ends up getting appended onto the back and then sent into a process that, I mean, yeah, I think I probably shouldn't be there, and I think maybe the HRA would be minded to agree with that in practice.
I think I was very lucky with the Camberwell Ethics Committee, I have to say. They were a bit more on top of social science.
That's great. And thank you, David, for the question. Thank you, James, for your response. Ala Jamal, you have a question now?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you for your presentations, everyone. My question is primarily directed to Emma, but also other researchers who have done participant observation at nursing homes. Currently, I'm doing my fieldwork, my PhD here in Copenhagen at a nursing home. And I've just started, and I've already realized the difficulty of consent and who and when to bring up the discussion around consent. So I'm curious to hear how you dealt with doing participant observation in a larger setting, talking to people who are not necessarily your key informants or who have obliged to participate in the research. So how do you deal with observing or interacting with these people?
Great question. And it's definitely has been a gray zone often in terms of cognitive impairment, because I tried to circumvent ethical issues by saying I'm only going to work with residents who do not have dementia. But then you enter the nursing home and you find out there's a whole spectrum of cognitive impairment, and some are diagnosed and some are not. And dementia is also used as a bit of an everyday kind of descriptor. You know, that person has a bit of dementia, whatever that means. So that's challenging. In terms of observing, do you mean sort of in the common areas of the nursing home? Yeah, so in the Danish context anyway, you're allowed to do that, and you're allowed to use that provided that you cannot recognize any of the people you're describing. So that's actually fairly easy to get around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm aware of that, but it has occurred to me in more, I guess, from a research perspective and from an ethical point of view, that as you describe, some have a bit of dementia or are on the spectrum of a neurological disorder. However, I find it difficult also with people who are employed at the nursing home, pretty much reiterating and telling them who I am and why I'm there. So legally, I understand that it's okay, but I somehow find it a bit difficult to manage whether or not this person is aware of who I am and why I'm there.
Yeah. I mean, process consent, I think, is great in that sense, you know, just constantly reminding them of who you are. But I also found that the need to talk amongst nursing home residents here anyway was so huge. They really didn't care who I was.
Yeah.
But that, of course, brings up other issues. So
exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll jump off for the question, Emma, for the response. Francesca, did you want to jump in as well and add something?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if maybe, okay, apart from vocal communication, but maybe there was another expression of that we can feel how the person with dementia is demonstrating that is connected to us. I don't know, maybe touching us, smiling, etc. I was thinking about that. We just have to think about. But in my experience, it was a great part of the relationship. Even if we were not sure if everybody was if I personally was understanding the other and vice versa. So but that was part of the relationship.
I think it's a good point you raised actually about the skill of being an ethnographer in this context, right? And actually how attuned you can be when attending to how a person around you is acting as well, sort of thing, right? So I know, one of the papers, I think Jamie Towser one talks about kind of possible discomfort of a person observing sort of thing, and how do you handle that situation, right? Because that could create a new ethical dilemma. But like, well, if a person feels uncomfortable with my presence, should I withdraw myself, right? And so withdraw from what? Withdraw from the whole common room? Withdraw just from being close proximity to them, sort of thing, right? So it always raises a lot of questions about how we can attend to people in those different contexts, sort of thing. Of course, don't necessarily answer for sort of thing, but I think it's an interesting discussion to have about that kind of that situated context of ethical production there too. Any other questions? Anyone else? Feel free to raise your hand or write something in the chat field. Christina, yeah, go ahead.
Just wanted to add a little bit to this discussion, and about that sort of uncomfortable situations, both for the participant and sometimes for us as well, by seeing people not being very comfortable with us. And I think is very much what Emma was saying as well, that there is this process consent that we can use and is not necessarily against what research ethics committees are actually talking about. The only thing is that they are talking about that we can employ it only after the approval. But I think with the process consent is, sometimes, and I think we shouldn't think of capacity as something or consent as something that has been given and that's it. And sometimes people can feel comfortable, sometimes maybe they won't be comfortable. So I think we really should take that into consideration every time when we talk to someone. And it's like with absolutely anyone else. And I think sometimes, and probably ethics committees as well, are doing this kind of not necessarily mistake or maybe fallacy, or I don't know exactly how to call it, that we think about people with dementia and getting the consent from them and about capacity and all that. And we almost stop at times to think that they are like us, we are like them as well. Sometimes we feel comfortable, sometimes we don't feel comfortable. So just not think all the time about capacity and consent, just interacting with someone else. And if I don't want somebody to be there, if somebody would talk to me as a student about my experience as a student, and I am able to say, then we should do exactly the same with anyone else, regardless whether they have cognitive impairment or not. And I think, yeah, this is one of the things that I see quite often in articles, that this idea of capacity is almost something that we take as an absolute, either as being there or not being there once we assess it. And I kind of see it as a problem. And just to follow on what Ala was saying as well about, should we note about these people or not? And well, the committee that we have in Scotland is a little bit tougher, because they don't have a lot of social science going through them, and they are, I think the chair is a radiographer or something like that. And one of the things that they've asked me is that I need consent from absolutely everyone, regardless whether they were in the public spaces or not. I wasn't allowed to go in their room anyway. And one of the things that I found was, like Emma was saying, that people want to talk to you, and sometimes you just talk to them, even if you don't maybe take notes about them. I think that's the ethical thing to do, even if we don't end up with actually data about that person. The ethical thing to do is just to talk to them. And I've ended up actually having days when I didn't have any data, because those people didn't give me, somebody on their behalf, which is the requirement here in Scotland, didn't give me consent on their behalf, but they wanted to talk to me, and I talked to them. But they were, should I call them as wasted days because I didn't have any data? It was actually just doing something that you need in the field. So yeah, sorry, Emma.
No, it's such a good point, but it also raises the question of what is data, right? Because when we're in the field, even though you can't take notes on that and you can't put it in an article, it still informs your understanding of the field.
Yeah, yes, you're perfectly right. And I think this one is something that I was raising as well. What do we do when actually, the legal things are allowing you to get consent on behalf? We can definitely see that those people really want to tell their stories, but their families don't want their stories to be known for different reasons. They might not be interested. They don't reply to our invitation to participate and to give consent for their relative and so on. So what's the ethical thing to do in that situation? How should we still tell their story or not? So it's really very problematic. And it was a massive issue that I had in my field. And this is post-approval, something that I didn't think when I with my ethics application. So sorry, there are quite a lot of people, so I think it's more important for them to talk. Yeah, and exactly what Janelle is saying as well. There are ethical problems also with not including people in research contributing to their invisibility of possible interest, and she gives us an article there. So thank you very much, Janelle. Yes, that's a massive issue. And
which I think, reflecting on kind of our experiences as editing the special issue, I think, I'll say one of my initial concerns when I read the Lily Shapiro's paper, and also colleagues sort of thing too, right? It's like, does it reinforce that invisibility sort of thing? But I thought it's still an interesting kind of way of problematizing the limitations of what ethnographic research can be too, right? And also how interests, when it comes to kinless people with dementia, right? So I think when actually if there is within the regulatory framework of the United States sort of thing, no other option to engage with this sort of thing, it's better to not engage with them at all sort of thing, or at least have kind of these artifacts like medical records as a way to kind of access that kind of life world in some way, even if it's kind of partial. So with that now, I'll now go to the list of questions now. So James, over to you first.
Yeah, actually, firstly, I was thinking in response to what Christina was saying, that I found it particularly in my work at the moment, which is a lot of recording video and things in public places, the contrast between ethical concerns around capacity and people with cognitive impairments compared with the liberalism, like the marked liberalism of British legislation around recording media in public places. Like on the one hand, it's like, oh yeah, go and film some children, do what you want to do. But also, do you want to ask a person with dementia a question? Well, now we're going to grill you. Like the difference between the two regulatory approaches I find quite interesting. I had a question for Emma, because I have encountered the same thing quite a few times. And I think this isn't just this is not a cognition specific thing, right? There are many types of research participant who are going to be very uncomfortable about signing paperwork, particularly if it's coming from a big institution. I was curious whether you had any conversations with the university about that and about changing those procedures, given that those procedures are largely potentially for the benefit of the institution.
I did, because I have a photo of the form, and I mean, it's, I don't know if you can see, but the font is tiny, right? And I'm working with people who are 85 plus, so most of them have, you know, are visually impaired, and it's kind of legalese language. And I actually asked the university, would I be allowed to make a simplified version in a bigger font so that they could actually understand what they were signing? And no, that was not allowed, which is crazy. I mean, it's so unethical. It really makes no sense. So yeah, it's a very good question.
Super similar experiences, like identical. Yeah.
If I can just add something to this, it's actually something that is not only about giving consent or obtaining consent from people with cognitive impairment, but it's something that is going a lot in biomedical research as well. How much actually people do understand from the participant information sheet. And there is a massive issue because actually people just sign it. So sometimes information being given there is not necessarily, explained enough. They have, of course, that thing at the end where they say, you can just ask the researcher if you have any further questions and so on. But actually, lots of people just sign it. And I've noticed the same about some of the relatives of my participants. And I just felt like telling them, you actually need to read it. But how can you tell that? How can you say, we want that kind of trust, but at the same time, we just want them to say, well, you shouldn't trust me just because I gave you this, So it's really problematic, but it's not actually something related only to people with cognitive impairment. So it's a big issue, I think, overall about the consent form, how informed it is, what does it mean informed, those kind of things that the universities are asking us to put there. Is it for whose benefit? So sorry, Eva, because you were in the line. So if you have a question, please go.
No problem. I have a small comment. I'm not sure if it's useful. It's useful for the nursing home setting, maybe. I'm not sure if it's useful for other contexts that you have been talking about. So I usually work with general consents when I do research, ethnographic research in nursing homes, and have quite good experiences with that. So what implies if you have a general consent is that you become somehow a member of the organization, and you have to also stick to certain rules inside the organization. And then I also did this with even with students. It worked with master students. And then we see to it that we have signifiers when we move through the field, which which we hope that reminds people that we are not staff, that we are not visitors, that we are not how do you say, people working don't know the word, other persons working in the nursing home or visiting or moving around in the nursing home, but that we have like a specific role inside this social organization. So I started thinking about if we could translate this to other settings which are not so clearly inside an organization, but I think this gives a lot of freedom to proceed, also because you do not know who are your participants and whom are you going to meet and with whom are you going to have closer exchanges, or just small exchanges. Gives more freedom to organize this. We also see to it that we have specific persons in the nursing home that are informed regularly on what we are doing, and which are also present to discuss if there are any ethical issues for us research or decisions that we have to take in the field on a let's say interaction to interaction basis. So that's how we do it when we do research in nursing homes. we had a similar project outside the healthcare system at all, and it worked quite well like this as well. So we had organizations where we were part and we had a general consent, and then we went on to smaller unities and had like a processual procedure to inform and to inform back also on those organizations that opened the doors for us somehow. And we'll be curious if someone else has similar experiences, or if this is like a unique solution that we have in our team. And if not, then go on to the next, and maybe someone can put something in the chat.
Well, a chance to kind of think through that a little bit, Ava, first, and we'll move on to Francesco in the meantime. But thank you for that provocation. Francesco, over to you, please.
Thank you. Now, I would like to speak on those on behalf who live in country where no formal ethical regulation or formal ethical review committees are in place, which means lots of countries outside North America, Canada, and UK. I would like to bring this reality into our discussion, just to demonstrate that there are many cases where the situation is far more complex. In our case, for example, universities for anthropological projects and qualitative projects do not have very formal relationship with the external or internal ethical committee of the review. So our paper and many of my colleagues who live in Italy, but not only in Italy, we struggle with not having direct indication or instruction on what to do. Because as I don't remember, I'm sorry, I don't remember what, who, but as someone said before, our supervisor, my supervisor was very in contact with me. But of course, I'm in the field where my supervisor is away, so it's not easy to contact him, and it's not easy to have this sort of daily conversation about ethical problems. Maybe problems that are not a problem for a more experienced researcher, and that is also this point of view. So I think it's very important to decolonize the discussion on ethical problems in ethnography, as is important to decolonize anthropology itself or qualitative research itself. And it's very important also to consider that we also have to discuss situations where ethical problems are in place. And these ethical problems are not just referred to ethical review committees, but they refer to ethnographic research itself. Also, because we always have to keep in mind that the very important dimension of ethical problems are what we do not write, not write. So that was just a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Francesco. That's a good point to keep in mind for us, and for the whole discipline, really, extending beyond just kind of the AGENET network and also the special issue we've collectively worked on. Lily, I think you actually have the final question given the time right now.
I just wanted to, I'll be quick, and then maybe there'll be one more chance for somebody else to sum up, but I just wanted to respond a little bit to what you said, Matthew, and it I think speaks to what you were saying too, Francesco. So one of the things that I think we found with this particular method was just, or that we found interesting, was just that we had to, and also were able to be much more explicit about sort of who and what we were including and who and what was we couldn't see or we weren't able to include. And I think that helped us to reflect on the fact that like there are those silences and absences in all kinds of research, ethnographic research and other kinds of research, but researchers aren't always super explicit about them, because there are people who are in the, who, Christine, as you're saying, who you chat with, but you can't include, you can't consent, but they sort of are like somewhere in the background there. And it's not that you should foreground them or or that anything should be happening differently. But I think one of the things that was interesting about this sort of slightly oblique method was just the necessity to be really clear about sort of like what you could and couldn't say based on who and who wasn't sort of visible or in the sample. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Leah. I think, as I mentioned before, I think your paper in particular really kind of made me question my own ethnographic imagination, right? About what I saw as kind of like the ethnographic method or participant observation, and actually the limitations of that approach in particular. And I think you're right. I think your approach, I think actually working in this space, even people in kind of more kind of applied settings too, it really demystifies the ethnographic process, right? You have to be very explicit about I'm spending X number of hours in this facility or this person's home sort of thing. Whereas colleagues who are kind of more traditional ethnographic projects, especially in anthropology departments, might say, I'm going to spend 18 months doing fieldwork in this site. Not even having to spend, break down into the day-to-day components, actually what they're actually doing, what fieldwork actually entails, sort of thing. So I think that is really good about demystifying actually what was that actually fieldwork actually look like, sort of thing, who are actually engaging with it, what's the purpose of that a bit more by having to be so stringent and prescribed actually in our fieldwork sort of thing too. Right. 1 minute until the end. So thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I wish we could go longer. I'll just add that one thing we're looking to do in the future, Christina, Barbara, and I, and hopefully others in the future too, is working on this ethics collective, which is part of the AGENET, which is the Aging Generations Network of IESA, as Svetlana mentioned earlier. As we all discussed today, it's rife with tricky challenges about how does one navigate these different things. And we also are aware that most contributors, both today, but also for a special issue, are people who are largely early career. So assistant professors, PhD students, or postdoctoral researchers and all that sort of thing. And they're often the first people in their groups to navigate these things. And the kind of trial by fire approach isn't really working for us all because it's taking us 26 months, as James mentioned earlier, to figure out things. So one thing I want to do is kind of create this kind of collective about how can we draw upon our collective wisdom based on our experiences or what we know about kind of different ethics regimes and regulatory frameworks, sort of thing, to help to inform these debates, or even just kind of very pragmatic features about how to proceed with these kind of constraints in the future too. So nothing to announce right now about that, unless Christina does, but it's something we'll be looking to engage with more in the future.
No, I think you summed up how we would like to take this further. There is a little bit more discussion about this, of course, how these kind of professional associations with which we started this whole conversation, like EASA, don't actually offer very much help. So it's almost like let's move into some sort of a form of self-governing peer support group, create some alternative, create some form of resistance collective, so we don't leave individuals struggle by themselves. So yeah, this thing actually is something that I found extremely helpful when I've applied for ethics, and Matthew helped me a lot. So maybe it's something that we will think about in the future, and how can we actually find very practical support in this when we struggle with these kind of issues. So yeah, it's something that we will just follow up. If everyone is interested, just email us and we'll send kind of the format. So thank you so much to everyone, to participants, and of course to our fantastic contributors, and for your presentations today, and looking forward to engaging more in conversation about this. So thank you, and enjoy your evening. You deserve a glass of wine or a bottle if you want. All right, thank you, and see you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.